In this video, I'll walk you through all the steps I took to create the finished scene you see here. At some point, there may be a need for a part 3 or a part 4 to this series to discuss how the substation is wired up and ultimately how it gets connected to a transmission tower line. However, before we get to part 2 of our substation project, I thought I'd share a few clips from a recent trip to Alaska, where we visited the White Pass and Yukon Railway. In 2020, most of the road's fleet was either put up for sale or stored serviceable, and they took delivery of 6 locomotives that were originally destined for a narrow gauge railway in Australia. These are equipped with EMD 645 prime movers and come in 2 different paint schemes. Taking a ride on this railroad is a great exercise for us model railroaders. Yes, even in the pouring rain. It allows us to feel okay about having sharp curves on our layouts, having rock outcroppings that are right beside the tracks, having tracks that are right on the edge of the layout. And of course, the very popular bridge that leads right into a rock-faced tunnel. And finally, there's nothing like the satisfaction of knowing there's a prototype for that return loop on your layout. This loop was specifically built for the short turn trips that just go up to the Yukon border and come back down to Skagway. And for you motive power fans, here's a close-up look at these new locomotives. They kind of look like an SD45 with the flared radiators, of course with that European or Australian cab. And one last clip from our cruise to Alaska. We'll just file this one under who doesn't love a good air horn. From our last video, you'll recall that the paint scheme was basically a darkish gray for the structural elements of the substation and an unintentional yellowy gray for the equipment. I combed through hundreds and hundreds of photos, and although I was actually able to find examples of yellowish or even dark green older transformers and equipment, I found that the structural portions of the substation in the dark gray really didn't show well on the layout. They were too dark, and my concern was that changing them to light gray and leaving the equipment yellowish really didn't sit well with my eyes. I was also concerned about not being able to highlight the insulators across the many different parts of the structure. I experimented with all kinds of different colors, from pure white to off-white and even pearl white, to give it a bit of a luster for that glassy look. Ultimately, I started over with a fresh coat of primer gray and settled on black for the insulators, and I gave the large circuit breakers and the main transformer just a hint of green in a slightly darker gray mix. I kept the light gray or pearl white for the large insulators on the main equipment just for a bit of variety, and touched up their tips with bright red. And lastly, all of the aluminum connecting rods were of course painted aluminum. And here's how it all comes together. You'll notice that we are now showing the substation on the other side of the layout across from the junction. That's because we had an operating session between these 2 videos, and it became very clear very quickly that this substation would really be in the way when trying to do any switching in this location. Before finalizing the exact location for the substation, I took some time to think about where the high voltage transmission towers would be located. I used my measuring tape as a sort of very long straight edge and was able to mark off roughly equal spacing for these towers starting from the tree line at the very back of the layout. Dividing the total length I had worked out to about 43 inches between each of the 4 towers. In HO scale, that's about 300 scale feet. Not bad. From Google Maps, I measured off 500 feet for the prototype, so scaling it down, it kind of fits. After tracing the outline of the substation base provided with the kit, I then proceeded to chip away at the first layer of plywood because I want the base to be recessed into the ground so that the top of it is flush with the rest of the surrounding area. This way I wouldn't have to fill in everything else to raise the land up all around it. Turns out that the 1-ply is a little thicker than the actual kit base, so I just padded out the opening with a few sheets of paper. After test fitting to make sure it all fits smoothly and flush, I removed all the components and painted the footings concrete and a metal gray for the metal plates. Before we get started with the ground cover, we have to talk a little bit about the fencing, specifically the fence posts. All of the fence posts and the 2 gates are included on a single sprue. The instructions say that you're supposed to trim the bottom part of the fence posts to about 1/16 below the collar, but I did not, as I'm going to drill through the pre-drilled holes in the base. The deeper foundations will make your fence a lot more stable. I did a test fitting just to make sure all the pre-drilled holes were clear. At first I wasn't sure whether to use a fine ballast or something finer for the ground cover in the substation area. The something finer alternative is something that I made myself by sifting 3 times actual limestone screening that you would buy in a Home Depot. I used this material several times before on the layout. Either way, ground cover is applied just like ballast. You place the ballast, spray it with a mixture of water and alcohol, and then apply a diluted white glue mix to flow into the surface. I started by only applying materials around the perimeter of the foundation, as that would allow the glue to seep in and fix it in place. Because of the few sheets of paper underneath the foundation, I made sure to put enough weight on it to keep it from lifting up as it dried. As you can see here, I tested both the fine ballast and the crushed limestone dust. In the end, I decided to go with the limestone dust everywhere, as I already had the main lines passing just above using the regular ballast. With the substation location nailed down, I turned my attention to the wider scene and penciled in a roadway and parking lot for the tower. I also marked out the outline of the tower with masking tape so no ground cover materials would end up underneath it. The first gravel area I laid down was the area in front of the signal bridge. I made this somewhat triangular in shape to indicate an area where service vehicles would have to make 3-point turns. This was followed by the roadway along the front side of the substation area, as well as the entranceway through the gates. To keep the roads a little more defined, I added an additional step by putting down glue first. Then I flooded the entire substation foundation with the crushed limestone. Note that the fence posts have to be installed before you do this to keep the pre-drilled holes from filling up with glue and materials. The diluted white glue gives you lots of time to pull out the fence posts before they harden in place. As the glue gravel mix dries out, it becomes somewhat plastic, which means you can create permanent indentations to indicate tire tracks. I repeated the same process for the connecting roadway and the parking lot around the tower. I also created a footpath around the tower by mixing in a little bit of actual dirt with the gravel to give it a darker, muddier look. After all the crushed stone areas had dried out fully, I used my static grass applicator to lay some long grass along the track and in other areas around the substation, followed by some shorter grass in the remaining open areas. Sometimes when I'm laying the shorter grasses, they look like they're laying down. I have to take a look at eye level to convince myself that, yeah, they're standing up all right. As I moved further away from the substation area, I refreshed the plywood top coat with a fresh coat of brown to simulate more earth beneath the shorter grasses. Here are a few shots of the finished scene overall, with the substation components reinstalled. A bird's eye view, and some close-ups of the substation itself. All that's left for this chapter of the project is to build and install the fencing. The spacing of the fence posts is 1 3/8 inches. For each side of the fence, I laid out the posts on the sticky side of a strip of painter's tape to hold them in position. The top and bottom fence rails are superglued to the underside and top side of the top and bottom collars of each fence post respectively. Because the 4 corner posts are shared, you have to decide which length of the fence they're going to be part of. I chose to make them part of the front and rear sections of the fence. That's the top and bottom runs in this image. As a result, the left and right side fences, that's the middle two in this image, need to have the top and bottom rails extending at least 1 3/8 inches beyond the posts on either side. Don't forget that the razor wire support brackets for the corner posts need to be angled at 45 degrees to the paper because they have to split the 90 degrees at each corner. The next step is to cut the large sheet of tulle that comes with the kit into 4 strips to represent the fence mesh. Once again, using the sticky side of a strip of painter's tape, press the tulle into it, make sure it's straight and not stretched, and then measure up 15/16 of an inch according to the instructions, and run a sharp blade along it to cut the strip. I chose to paint the wire mesh and fence frame separately before gluing them together. This assures a more complete coverage of the aluminum paint on all components of the fence. This is just a pet peeve of mine. I find all too often in kits some of the small parts that are molded from 2 halves in the tooling process, they don't match up. It's especially frustrating when these parts are meant to be used as hinges or moving parts, as they are in this case. These are the hinges on the ends of the gates. I reamed out the holes to make sure the gates would function. But it really isn't necessary if the manufacturers would pay attention to the quality control process for their tooling. All right, we're getting there. This is almost the last step, but it's one that requires a lot of patience. While holding the strip of mesh taut, you need to apply a tiny drop of glue along each post and rail. I chose to spread it along with a tiny spatula, being very careful to work quickly because, as you know, crazy glue or ACC dries rather quickly. This process is then repeated for all 4 sides of the fence, remembering to keep a little bit of extra overhang at each end. Before starting the fence installation, I drilled out all of the fence post holes to make them a little bit deeper. Here's a look at the first or bottom fence line installed. The first one is the easy one. The other sides are a little more tricky because you have to weave them into each other at the corners, so you know where to clip them so that it looks like each side ends at a corner post. Here are some close-up photos of a couple of the corner posts so you can see what it looks like before they're trimmed. Note how the side fences that don't have end posts have to sit or rest above the top rail and below the bottom rail of the opposite fence to keep the mesh taut. These are the tools I use to cut off the excess mesh and fence rails at each of the corner posts. And this is roughly what the corner post should look like when you're done trimming. And that brings us to the very last step in this project, at least this phase of it, and that's the swing gates. I should have mentioned this earlier, but hopefully you're not building this kit while you're watching the video. When you're trimming the fence rails on either side of the gate opening, you have to leave about 1/8 of an inch overhang so you can bend it 90 degrees for the fence gates to rest on. I ran out of super glue before I could finish gluing all the pieces of mesh onto the fence frames, so I tried an alternative, white glue. It seemed to work fine on the gate, so I used it to tuck in any loose pieces of mesh elsewhere along the fence. You just need to be careful not to fill up the mesh with glue. No harm though if you do. You just keep a sharp pin handy to poke the openings, and it's like bursting a bubble. Here's a look at the completed swing gates and an overview of the substation area before the equipment is reinstalled. There are a few bits of leftover parts, mesh, and wire. We'll save those for another fence project at a later date. And here's a final aerial tour of the completed seam. Enjoy. As mentioned in our last video, I did purchase the Walthers modern transmission towers. I'm not convinced that they're tall enough for high tension wires, but I did a little bit of research, and towers do come in various heights depending on the voltage. I found this line of towers not too far from where I live. They're 110,000 volts, and the base is only about 8 feet wide. So I'm guessing they're probably around 80 or 90 feet tall max. So in theory, the Walthers towers can be used, but I'm getting an itch to maybe try and scratch build these. It's mostly made up of a couple of different sizes of angle strips, which you can easily represent with evergreen styrene. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoy layout improvement videos, here are a few others that you may find interesting.